Welcome back to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we'll be looking at a text for Easter Sunday. My guests today are Bishop Jennifer Baskerville Burrows, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Indianapolis, and Brian Sellers Petersen, a coach and consultant focused on agrarian ministry and coordinator of Good News Gardens. Before we begin our episode, just a reminder about our annual resource. This year's resource is The Power of God from Extractive Theology to Transforming Faith. In it, we discuss theological notions of power, just transitions to renewable energy, and stories of churches using their collective power for the sake of community. The resource also includes elements for worship, including 7 original songs. You can download the resource at www.creationjustice.org/powerofgod. Join us now as we look at Acts 10 through the lens of creation justice. So our text for today is Acts chapter 10, verses 34 to 43. Then Peter began to speak to them. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every people, anyone who fears him and practices righteousness is acceptable to God. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. That message spread throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John announced, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. We are witnesses to all that he did both in Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. But God raised him on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who were chosen by God as witnesses, and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. So, where is creation in this passage?
For me, it's in Judea and Galilee, and with a guy who's from Nazareth. So it's those physical places for me, right off the top of my head.
I've always been struck in this passage how the words that they killed him by hanging him on a tree, which is such a different image than the crucifix that we're used to understanding the crucifixion by. And it's a living thing, but a cross by which a crucifixion happens is not a living thing to me in the same way. So it's yeah. So anyway, it's just it's a fascinating shift in what I would expect every single time I hear that phrasing.
Yeah, when you started talking about the tree, Jennifer, I just had that image of the tree of life.
Right.
You know, that I love that symbol of for our faith. And I love the ones that have birds and other living things in the branches. But until you said that, I haven't thought, I haven't read this with the tree in mind. Just a couple dead pieces of wood.
Right. And so to me, the tree is a witness. I mean, thinking about it that way, and of course, I can't help but think about lynchings and the bodies that have hung on trees in this country, and the juxtaposition of violent death on something that is living, often decades, even into centuries, to bear witness to both life and death at the same time.
Yeah, and even, I'm so glad that you went there, because that image, I mean, when we hear, there's one thing that comes to our mind when we hear nailed to a cross. And that's kind of the standard Good Friday image, but they hung him on a tree does something completely different to my brain, and I think for us as Jennifer, for us as African Americans, I think it does something very specific to our brains, and it brings up a completely different image that is really jarring and really particularly in this context of Peter giving a sermon. um and I love the way that you just said that, of like um this tree being a witness, this tree being a witness, this thing that's living being witness to this horrible act of violence. um for me, that wording does something completely different to me than all of the other, even the things that, even the images, the somewhat gruesome images that the cross brings up for me. This does something, it does something different. It does something different. um yeah.
So I want to know why that word is used here versus
I-
all the other descriptions of the crucifixion or just images of Jesus dying for us. I mean, because I'm not looking at the Greek text and being able to see that word there, I do know that I'm reading a different translation. I'm looking at the Revised New Jerusalem Bible as you read that text, Derek. And so I think the word is consistently used
Mm,
in the translation
Yeah.
we have. And so I'm assuming that there's a reason for that,
mm, mhm.
um, that choice.
And I wonder, Brian, to your point, I wonder if it goes to other connections to trees that are a part of our spiritual lives, of thinking about the tree of life, of thinking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of thinking about the rich imagery of trees that are a part of the Judeo-Christian, and particularly at this point, the Jewish text and understanding of who God is, and maybe adding this tree to that canon of trees. I wonder if maybe that's what they were going for.
Yeah, it brings to mind, I live right up next to this forest land with
Mm,
trees all over the place. And if, a block away is the cemetery. And if I walk through the cemetery, there's this forest. And I have this sit spot that I love to go to. And I'm kind of stuck and fixated on it. It's a tree that has the rim of a barrel that has grown up inside of.
hmm,
So this is the land of the Yakima, but it was settled in the late 1800s by coal miners from mainly Eastern Europe. And I have a feeling this spot was kind of the junkyard for our
mm,
little village.
hmm,
And a barrel was left um, there. And this tree grew up in the middle of it. And all that's left is the rim
hmm,
of the barrel. And so you look at it, and there's no way someone put that on this
hmm,
tree.
hmm.
That tree literally had to have grown up around that barrel. And kind of that's where my sit spot is.
Hmm.
Um, because it takes me to, and I like to take my shoes off too. And so when I'm sitting by that tree, get really grounded
Mm,
on that land that the Yakima people and these coal miners and generations. I have a feeling this looks like a perfect place for kids to get into mischief as well over the years. But
yeah,
trees could tell us so much.
yeah, What a cool image of a tree kind of like outlasting that settler, colonialism, outlasting that settler, that vestige of, you know, being colonized and having having the evidence of the colonizing still there, but the tree is the thing that lasts. That's kind of cool. There's
No, I don't
another.
know if that might have been a complete red herring. When you start talking about a tree, that's kind of one of the that's where I go to.
That's okay. It's okay. If it's a red herring. I don't mind. I don't mind.
Okay.
I'm up for anything here. There's another creation image for me that's really strong. And Brian, you pointed out the places, like the physical places, as part of creation, and that was, I think that's connected to this. But the other piece that Peter says is that um, after Jesus is raised, not all people got to see him, but there was a few, and they got to eat and drink with him, and that they got to have that experience of food. This is me, so obviously I'm gonna default to the food images.
No,
But
no, Jennifer and I, we don't default to the food at all.
I was holding back on that one.
I was about to say, if anyone's gonna be sympathetic to my defaulting to food, it's you two.
Yeah.
But like I think so why were you holding back, Jennifer? And where and
Well,
where did
this
your
is a little on
mind
the
go?
nose, trying to not play to type too much.
But what is that food image? What is that food image in that particular place? What does that do for you?
I don't know, it's just so elemental, right? It is so core to the way that Jesus moved about the earth when he was living. Like that's how relationships were forged and solidified. It's the places where things happened, were at these tables that he gathered people around. I mean, there's always some food and drink involved, it seemed a good majority of the time. So, and then of course in the post-resurrection experiences, there is that kind of quote unquote proof of life, as the young people would say, of him. Like proof of resurrection life is him having these meals, whether it's the fish on the beach or coming back and asking for a morsel to eat, because of course resurrection makes you hungry. So I just like, of course you would want to reference that here, because it's almost kind of part of the canon of how we understand Jesus' resurrection. Like we have to remember that this is what it was about. We ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead, because that's a way that we knew that it was Jesus, because all of those memories of having done it before in the history of people's experience with him.
So I'm just thinking, they probably at the Last Supper, I'm pretty sure they had olives and that they were eating, and I wonder what they did with the pits. Did they just throw them out on the ground nearby? Did they throw them in the perfect spot where that pit, that seed, came back to life, and that there's an olive tree on that spot right now as we're sitting here? I always think I love compost as a metaphor for resurrection. We throw all that, what we think is dead, useless stuff, and into the pile. And then a month or two, or maybe in the spring after it's been under there, we take a scoop and there's these earthworms. There's all this living stuff that have been resurrected. But I like to think about that olive tree. Who knows? I don't know. because we know we've got olive trees. There's olive trees in Palestine
Right.
that are pretty old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun to think about what that might have looked like, and it's fun to think about, you know, the idea that eating together for the disciples was such a defining experience, like a core memory, like there are some people, there's some people in my life who I think of, you know, all of my memories of them are in a kitchen. All of my memories with them are around a table. All of my memories with them are them eating something. And yeah, that proof of life being that, oh yeah, that's him. That's him. You know, that's our Jesus, because this is how we know him. You know, more so than the miracles and the teaching. As his friends, we know him as the guy around the table. Kind of love that.
Well, right, because I think, I mean, at least in this part of the Acts passages, like the healings are named, right? But it's almost as if you cannot be a witness if you had not eaten or drunk with the risen Jesus. Like it's a part of what it means to have witnessed
Yeah.
the resurrection. It's in a way it's kind of liturgical, like this remembering this act that was so central that Jesus actually said to remember him by, like you've got to recall it.
Yeah.
And there was something, Brian, that you made me think of, which I'm thinking this might be something I might use for at the time of recording this. This is not Holy Week yet, but Monday, Thursday is coming. And so I'm like, oh, we call it the Last Supper because it's easier than saying the 545th Supper. Because like there would have been so many, right? So we're just gonna call it what it is. It's the last one, but it's the last of how many others. It was so much a part of his ministry of presence and relationship.
That's good. So, where do we see, you know, we've talked about this a little bit already. Where do we see humanity interacting with creation? In what Peter is preaching, what Peter is saying, and what Peter is doing. Where do we see humanity interacting with creation?
I'd go into the places. I get, you know, where the conflicts are. You know, I think, you know, all that interaction going on. There are 35 armed conflicts going on in Africa right now. I think about the Ukraine, you know, the human lives lost, but the devastation of the land. You know, we keep hearing about conflicts over land and access to water. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, how does that connect you to this passage?
Jennifer.
I'm asking you, Brian.
No, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think maybe there's a way in which it's so much assumed, right? Like there's not this forward sense of like here's creation and humanity interacting. It just is, right? There are people who are positioned in a place. There's a geography. They name that geography. You know, they could just say that we're witnesses to everything he did about everything he did, but no, it was actually in a place in the countryside of Judea and in Jerusalem. And so by naming that location, and I think that's just a helpful positioning of where this ministry took place, and that's an important detail to not lose. And so whatever the countryside might evoke either historically or now, I think there's a sense in which it's important to not let it be anonymous place, you know. And maybe that's something that helps us understand, like wherever we might happen to be, it actually matters that these places are a place with names which evoke a number of things around culture and identity and activity and history and all those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I like that one of the disciplines in the church when we get to the prayers of the people on Sunday to actually name places. You know, we can't name all 35, we don't have enough time, but we raise up some to point to other places that are close to our hearts and far away.
Well, and I'm really glad you both went there, because uh, I think for most American readers, maybe for folks who have traveled to the Holy Land, these spaces might have a little bit more resonance. But I would think for most American readers of Scripture, these are just random names, and the names themselves don't have a whole lot of meaning, but they would have had meaning in the context, in the way that, like, um you know you're talking about the conflicts that are in Africa, and the way that Gaza does for us right now, the way that Ukraine does for us right now, the way Sudan has for us right now. But even like when you but bringing it closer to home, like when you say Flint, when you say Flint, Michigan, you know, there's there's still a reminder that goes off in my brain of like, oh right, they still don't have clean water.
Ferguson, Missouri.
Ferguson, Missouri, Columbine. There are places that we like attach these meanings to, um, where it's not just a point on the map. It's the location of you know something tragic. It's the reminder of something broken. And you know Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and Nazareth, these places where we're constantly, as we look at them referenced in Scripture, people are asking, can anything good come from these places? They're asking questions of like, what's the value of these? These are the forgotten places of the empire. These are the overlooked places of the empire. And then Jerusalem is the place of conflict. It's the place of, and still a place of conflict. And it's the place of politics. And it's the place of, the way that we 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 would say Jerusalem, in the biblical text, the way that we say DC, and it would be loaded in the same way that we say DC.
Because there is any place that we remember with fondness that's universally known. I'm going, when you say Winnetka, do people think about beautiful lawns and streets to live on? I mean, or Palm Beach, or like there's an attraction. I mean, and those are wonderful places. So let me just say that. For anybody who lives there, I used to live next to Winnetka in Wilmette. I got it. But the reason why these names are so evocative, particularly because there are places where hard things happen, but also we get up to the edge of transformation, if not beyond, right? Like we remember these places because it either something hard has happened there, but it's created a need for something for change, or change has followed, either if not in that location, in the zeitgeist of the community, no matter whether it's local or more global. And so we remember those names and they evoke all of this stuff. Otherwise, we don't remember these places, right? Pleasant
Yeah.
places where good things happen all the time we don't talk about them in the same way. I'm just gonna say, I mean, Kent, Ohio, right? Like I just
Yeah,
the
yeah,
places, and because the way we remember them is because we rehearse the stories of what happened there over and over again, and that's why like we know Columbine 20 something years after that horrible tragedy.
yeah.
Anyway,
You
that's
know,
a podcast, I'm
it's
sure, but there's something about
I think it's
that.
totally relevant to this one. No,
I
absolutely.
I'm you know, I love how you come across these cities, towns, villages in the United States with biblical names.
Mm.
Oh, well,
You,
also,
you know, so when I think of Lebanon, Indiana, the
right?
cedars of Lebanon,
Yeah,
um, you know, uh, Zion,
yeah. We got a lot of them here in Indiana. Let me
you
just.
do.
and and how often people just named them because they're like, well, that's a nice biblical name, instead of thinking about might there be any kind of, you know, associations that we want to avoid.
Well, I mean, well, anyway, I would love to know why people named. I mean, we have so many religious place names here, and I'm sure it has everything to do with people's hopes to either claim the best of what those names have meant in scripture or to transform them, right?
Yeah.
Zionsville, Indiana, was, I think, a particularly intentional name, right? To
Mm,
Zion. So, anyway, it's a fascinating conversation to think
yeah.
about.
It's maybe aspirational. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But but I think this is such a, like, I don't think, um in our conversations on this podcast, I don't know how often we talk about place as part of creation, that the places where things happen are in fact, more than just backdrops. They are cities with living people. They are cities and towns that have animals and trees and people and rivers and things that are living in them. They're not just points on a map. They're not just data points. Um, they're not just and for this, for this time, um, it kind of amuses me with, traveling a lot more for work these days. Parts of our country that are referred to as flyover country,
Ah,
and that, this would have been a flyover. Like Jerusalem, Judea would have been flyover country for the Roman Empire. But as you pointed out, Jennifer, it's these spaces where transformation happened, and that's why the spaces become really important.
So I was in Georgia, Gainesville, Georgia, North Georgia, over the weekend, and at Grace Church in Gainesville, Georgia. And the rector, Stuart Higginbotham, has this sign on his bookshelf that one of his parishioners says, and it says Gainesville in big letters, and it says 6,390 miles from Golgotha.
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, well, there's the clear sense of humor to that, but that you know his office is 6,000 miles away from Golgotha.
Yeah.
There's something deeper there that I'm still trying to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's Yeah, I won't hold us up with that. I got to think about that one
Again,
a little.
yeah,
I got to think
there's
about that
something
one a
there.
little more.
It's been bugging me now for like 4 or 5 days.
But again, a place where transformation happened, so
In a
a place of
Yeah,
tragedy
that's
and transformation.
yeah, in
Place
a
of the
church.
skull, literally the place of the skull,
Yeah,
where
and that sign
transformation
is
happened.
in That sign is in Grace Church
Yeah.
in North
Interesting.
Georgia.
There you go. There's almost connection
Wow.
points there.
Right, right.
So, in light of all of this, of thinking about all the ways that we've seen creation in this passage, I'm thinking about this is a passage that shows up for uh, Easter, because it's Peter's public retelling of Jesus's ministry and resurrection. Where is there a call to action for the church here? Where is there something that we can take away and use?
I will say that given this conversation and the things that we've been talking about, the first thing that comes to my mind in this season, Easter 2025, is that it's actually helpful to know how to rehearse and recall the history and the story while we're watching a lot of our history and story be erased from places where you would go to get that history and story, right? If we're losing our corporate memory because there are choices being made about what that story is, and not everyone gets to be in that story, I think our call is to remember the places where hard things and transformation happens and has happened, and to tell it. Because if we're not bearing witnesses of it continually, knowing that God has shown up in those places every time, because God does that, then we're going to lose who we are as our understanding of a people. So I think the call to action here is to think about, well, where are the places that we want to remember? And some of them are places that none of us, the three of us, would know, but we all have places where we have been, where we've persevered and gotten through, God's gotten us through, and to know how to tell that story so that we can be witnesses to a story that connects to this great story of Jesus' resurrection that happened in a place, among a people, in a time, and that we know that story because people kept telling it. So what's our story to tell?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll preach that on Sunday. He's so I don't know. I'm thinking this is really helpful for me. But
there
I
you
think
go.
that's kind of where
That's really well, a lot to think about, as there's public policy, executive orders that are being put out there that are going to make those stories less visible, that our children and our grandchildren may not hear if we just let civil society take care of it. We have to personally recall those stories, painful as some of them are. I know from my own growing up, there was, in this little town in Minnesota was the site of the largest mass execution in U.S. history. An executive, the execution order was signed by Abraham Lincoln. There's 39 native Lakota were executed, down by the river where I grew up. We never learned about that as a kid. I was till I was in my 40s where I really started getting the full story. And now it's taught in all the schools. There's field trips. There's all sorts of things that happen. But if we're not careful, stories like that are virtually in every place in our country and beyond. If we don't take responsibility for sharing those stories, our kids and generations to come may not hear them.
And I wonder. I don't wonder. I don't wonder. I feel like I know that a lot of where we are right now as a country is because of places where the hard stories have not been allowed to be told.
Yes.
It's because people have had skewed versions of American history that have made America the good guy at every turn. And have made white Americans in particular
Yeah.
the good guy at every turn. And how interesting it is for the lectionary that like this isn't the story of the resurrection. It's the story of Peter telling the story of the resurrection, and how important, and Peter telling the story of Jesus's ministry, not the story of Jesus's ministry, right? That like part of this is uh a little bit of um the writer of Acts telling us this is a little bit of what it means to be a disciple,
Mhm.
is the telling of story, the telling of the hard stories, the telling of the grace, the telling of the triumph on the other side, but the telling of the hard part, the telling of the hanging on a tree, right? Um, yeah, yeah, that's really powerful because it's um, you know, this Easter in some ways may not feel as celebratory, as other years, right? But in some spaces, it may not feel as celebratory, but it's important that we tell the story.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, as I was thinking about preparing for Easter preaching, about this preaching in 2020,
Mm.
Easter in 2020, where, we still didn't know what was happening. And I just remember, oh yeah, that didn't feel like it was going to be Easter, but there was still the sense of hope. So now, like, how do you preach? Because we didn't know what was coming at that point. This is not where we are now. Like we are in it and we know what has been, what might be coming. And so to be a witness means to tell the story, not because it's just the act of telling the story without any meaning, but we tell it because we believe it, and because we know that whether the world's on fire or not on fire, it's still the story. And and God's story of death and resurrection is always happening. So there's no way for us as Christians, as disciples, to be here and not to be able to be a witness to that ongoing story of death and resurrection that happens in a place, to a people, in a time that's happening even now. So we need to learn how to do that. And I think Peter gives us an example of what that looks like, and a pretty extraordinary example. We don't all have to go and stand on street corners and preach the witness, but boy, we can talk to our friends and our loved ones and our communities about being a witness, because we all need to hear it, I think, even if we don't call ourselves Christian. In this moment, I think we all need to hear a story of hard things and the overcoming of them, and the new life that's still possible. So we all have an opportunity to be a Peter in this way, right?
Mm.
My granddaughter's teacher, as a way of talking to the kids about civil rights, this is a 7-year-old, shared that painting of Ruby Bridges,
Mm.
with my granddaughter. And, um, that picture, that image is kind of locked in this 7-year-old's head. And she talks about Ruby, and she knows the basics about Ruby being able to go to school. Um, and I think that art and icons, I mean, that picture of Ruby being escorted by these big guys to school as an icon. Yeah, storytelling is really important, or telling stories about people telling stories is important.
Yeah.
Because we can't imagine that even in Peter's day, there were people who didn't want that story to get out.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. That's right.
Like, we're not all that special this time. It's just different media at our disposal. But like there are folks who fought to tell that story and made sure that it got passed down, right?
And let us not forget that Peter was eventually silenced in telling his story.
Well, there's that.
There's
too,
that.
right?
That is a
But
part
that
of
story,
that's part of this
has
as
been-
well.
but the story's been told over and over and over again
Yeah.
through the millennium.
Yeah. And lives on, despite the attempts of empire to silence Peter and silence Peter's story.
Mhm.
Well, I just wanted, like, as we're wrapping this up, kind of going back to where we started, this idea that as we are bearing witness to all the things to which we're bearing witness right now, and maybe don't want to bear witness, but we are, that creation bears witness as well.
Mhm.
That creation bears witness to those transformative moments of pain, those transformative moments of suffering, those transformative moments where it looks like new life is impossible, but ultimately it becomes possible. And there's a invitation here for us to bear witness along with creation. Which I think is important as well.
Yes.
Jennifer, Brian, this was really fun. Really good to be able to do another podcast with you, a different podcast with you. But thank you so much for sharing these thoughts that, it's going to be a different kind of Easter. And I do hope that people will take advantage of maybe giving a different kind of Easter sermon, different kind of Easter message. And I think maybe you've given them a little bit of food for thought to do that. So thank you both.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Sprocket Wagner, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and help us spread the word with a good review. You can support this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org/donate.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound. Within these pages, there's always new life to be found.